I don't know how you feel about adversity. Maybe you're the kind of person who lives for it. You're like the Pinterest poster that has the motivational slogan about adversity, about how something like adversity is nothing more than an obstacle that helps us improve. The one on the right says adversity is like a strong wind. It tears away from us all but the things that cannot be torn, so that we see ourselves as we really are. You see adversity as nothing more than an opportunity. You see adversity as like a good thing. It may not be pleasant. You are like, bring it on. I'm all for it. Maybe it's because you're like a hyper-competitive person, and as soon as competition is on the table, it's like you've been injected with 1,000 cc's of adrenaline, and you are ready to go. You are not afraid of adversity. If you know me, I am not a competitive person. So whether you've played games, you'll know that I lose interest in about 5 minutes at the very most. I don't care who wins, really. I enjoy watching people play. I don't really enjoy playing games. And so if there's ever like a game night and you see that I'm not playing, it's because I'm enjoying watching everybody play. I think ultimately that comes down to the fact that I am just not competitive. I don't have the eye of the tiger. I remember when I was in football in high school, as well as wrestling, my dad would constantly say, you could do so much better, and he was supportive, so it wasn't like he was putting me down. But it's just this reminder that if I was more aggressive, if I hit harder, or if I realized what I was capable of, it'd be totally different. Fun fact, the high school that I went to in Minnesota, they won state championship again for football this past week. And so it was a really, really good high school football program that I was a part of. But because I'm just not very competitive, I wasn't the star player. I wasn't the starter. And I think in many ways that also sort of translates into how I handle adversity. I don't like adversity. It's not really something I look forward to. When something doesn't go right, I can very easily fall apart. If you guys know those demotivational posters, some of them are on that screen as well. It says adversity. Something along the lines of, whatever doesn't kill you just delays the inevitable. And so maybe that's more along your worldview. As soon as something happens that is an adverse situation, you just can't handle it, or it just wipes you out. It can either charge you up or it can wipe you out. But regardless of how we feel about adversity, whether we see it as a positive thing or only a negative thing, eventually it all wears us out. Eventually we reach this point where we just can't handle bad news anymore. We need to break it. After a while, it doesn't really seem to matter that we all sort of reach a breaking point. In the Bible, there are many themes, there are many patterns, there are many repeated storylines. I think that kind of shows the creativity of how the Bible is written. Sometimes when we're reading the Bible and we don't always know what we're reading, we can get bored. And I understand that, but I think sometimes it is because we don't really know how to read it. And there is this repeated theme all throughout the Scriptures, all the way from the beginning to almost the end, of adversity, where God will make a promise, and almost immediately something happens, something comes along to threaten that promise. God will make a promise, and then it seems almost on the next page, or even the next sentence, well, how can God's promise come true then if this just happened? I mean, we see even in the Garden of Eden about how basically God gives everything to humanity with one stipulation: don't eat from this tree. And immediately they eat from that tree, and they're cast out from the garden. And the same thing with the book of Nehemiah. God makes a promise, or to be more accurate, he reminds Nehemiah and the nation of Israel of the promises that he has made, and immediately there is adversity. There are challenges to those promises. And we're going to see that this morning as we study chapters 2 through 4. There are adverse situations. There are enemies. There are villains that seem like they're out of movies because they seem so one-dimensional. There are adverse situations that Nehemiah and the nation of Israel face that forces them to evaluate, do we really trust God? Do we really trust that God is able to keep his promise to us, as well as sustain us in the midst of adversity? And as we read this book, you see how elements of Nehemiah, who's sort of this, in many ways, sort of this quintessential leader. Like a lot of times in the Bible, when you study leadership, a lot of times you'll see in Nehemiah as lifted up because of his leadership, his character, his ability to kind of, the phrase, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. You see Nehemiah as almost like this zealous person, this single-minded, focused person who is so consumed with the glory of God that it seems like nothing is able to stand in his way. But as we've said in the past, this book is not ultimately about how to be a good leader like Nehemiah is. This book is not ultimately about how to stay faithful during a building project when the contractor doesn't show up or something like that, because that happens. Ultimately, this book is written by the Spirit of God through human authors to show that God is the hero of his own story, that God is able to raise up people and use them to accomplish his purpose for God's glory, to show that the God of the Bible is the God who keeps his promise to his people, even when it seems like the situation is hopeless. In Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah gets the news report that Jerusalem has been destroyed. Well, it was destroyed a while back, but even after the first people who came back from exile were there and they sort of rebuilt the temple and reestablished it, the walls of Jerusalem, their security system, their sense of peace that they could have, that they wouldn't be attacked, was still destroyed. It says the gates were destroyed by fire and the walls were torn down. And so Nehemiah is crushed by this news. And he wants to do something, but ultimately what he does first is that he prays, and he reminds God, not that God needs to be reminded, but he turns back to God and says, God, you are powerful, you are good, you are patient, you are caring, you are loving. Don't forget the promises that you made to your people, that you will restore us. We have experienced the consequences of what happens when we walked away from you. And now restore us as we have turned back to you. And so God starts to move in Nehemiah. But not just in Nehemiah. God starts to move in the heart of a pagan king named Artaxerxes. It's amazing how the Bible story paints this picture of a God who is so powerful that he is even able to sort of work and control the actions of kings who don't know him. Other passages in the scriptures say that basically the heart of the king is in God's control. God directs the king where he wants them to go. And that's referring even to pagan kings. Artaxerxes' response to Nehemiah, Artaxerxes, the powerful king of Persia, sees Nehemiah, his cupbearer from a different nation. Nehemiah is depressed. He's despondent. And so Artaxerxes, because he cares for Nehemiah, says, what's wrong? I noticed you're upset. And in those days, you don't be upset in the presence of the king. You are not supposed to be despondent in the presence of the king. You are supposed to be living your life like being in the presence of the king is the greatest thing in the world. But nonetheless, Artaxerxes realizes that Nehemiah is depressed and he says, what's wrong? And so Nehemiah tells him. He hears the report about Jerusalem and how it's still destroyed, and the hidden hand of God, as some people might even say, or even in this case, in the explicit purpose of God, the gracious hand of God, Nehemiah is actually able to ask the king, Artaxerxes, let me go back to Jerusalem and rebuild. Let me go back. Now consider this. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, which means that he is the poison control for the king. He's the guy who eats the king's food or drinks the king's drinks to make sure that it's not poisoned. And so for this guy to just all of a sudden say, hey, can I leave? The king might even think to himself, well, what's going on here? Is something happening? None Not even to mention that the king is the king and this guy is still the servant, even though he's in good standing. But nonetheless, the king agrees to let him go. And not only does he let him go, he basically agrees to Nehemiah's terms and gives him kind of the corporate credit card to Lowe's and Home Depot. He writes him a letter to like the keeper of the forest along the way and says, give Nehemiah whatever it is that he needs. Anything that he wants, he can have. He gives him an armed guard as he's traveling through, because this is kind of like, in some cases, like, the Wild West. You're not secure when you travel. You are at the mercy of the bandits or whoever is in control. And so the king gives him the credit card for supplies, and he gives them a military escort to make sure that he is safe. And so he's leaving with this awesome sense and this awesome promise. But as he's leaving, there is almost like a parenthetical comment. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. And so there are these villains that get introduced, and they come back several times throughout the scriptures. They're like the thorn in the side of Nehemiah. In this case, you can kind of see them like Nehemiah and company are leaving, and as they're leaving, they walk by these guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, and they're looking at them, and they're kind of like, how do we stop this? And we think to ourselves, well, who are these people? They have some political power. They have some influence in society. And ultimately, they're people who don't want to give up what they have. They're the people who are in control and are liking things the way that they're going. But as soon as God's plan starts to interfere with that, that's not okay. As soon as God's will, as soon as God's words, God's plans, His purposes, His priorities for His people start to upset the status quo of what's going on, that's not good. And it has to be shut down. So these guys kind of represent the wealthy, the politically sort of gifted people, the ones who are in control, who Christianity, if we were to apply it to this day, is okay as long as it doesn't challenge what we believe to be true. Christianity is okay as long as it only sort of shapes the way that you live your life on Sunday. But as soon as you start to bring that stuff into the political sphere, the economic sphere, the educational sphere, then we have a problem. And as soon as they sort of find out about it, they start hatching a plan. We have to stop this. And so Nehemiah gets back to the city. He does this nighttime reconnaissance, kind of by himself, where he's got this small group of people who are with him. He's riding like a donkey or a horse around the city, and he's seeing how all the gates have been burned and all the walls have torn down. And it's some really cool writing when you read it, because he comes to this one point where there's so much rubble that he can't get by it on his own horse or on his own donkey. And so he actually has to get off his horse and sort of walk on it by himself, or there's even so much rubble that he just basically has to turn around. The city is in such bad shape. And so he gets back and he tells the people, I've got a bad news and I've got a good news. The bad news is it's as bad as you thought it was. Probably even worse. But I got good news. God's gracious hand has been on me. God has raised me up. He has brought me here so that we can rebuild the city and no longer be a disgrace. And you can see how God's hand is in this, and that the people respond by basically saying, let's do it. Let's get down to business. Let's get to work. And it's like this movie montage. The next section of this passage is like the movie montage where the hero, kind of stirs up the emotions of the village people who are in desperate need, and everybody starts in. Everybody responds. Let's get this good work started. Now here's the thing about Nehemiah, is God doesn't immediately solve their problem of broken walls. Once they say, let's get started, and then cuts to God. And God doesn't say something like, well, now that I see that they're willing, I'll solve their problem for them. And I'll send a tornado that somehow reestablishes the walls of Jerusalem. Rather, God's plan for his people is not to magically cure all of their problems, but rather God's plan for his people is to use them, to work together to rebuild the city brick by brick. And again, the villains come back and they say, basically, what do you think that you're doing? Are you trying to rebel against the king? So again, we have motivation, we have promise, we have a great situation, and here come the villains again. And Nehemiah's response is that God will give us success because we are his servants. Remember, Nehemiah is doing this because of his concern for God. Nehemiah is not doing this because he wants to rebuild the city and maybe God will bless him and it'll be well. But rather, Nehemiah wants God's glory to be the most important thing. He wants God's honor among his people to be reestablished. And so we are God's servants. And immediately he says, because we are his servants and you are being an obstacle to us, you have no part in this. You have no claim to this city. And it's almost like that's the breaking point between Nehemiah and these villains. And it's like after that, the villains start to unleash a plan to stop them at no expense, spare no expense. And so chapter 3 is this church cleanup project, writ large, big time. They get everybody who is sort of in the city. The whole chapter is basically a list of all the people who are participating in the church building project. And a lot of times it will actually tell you what they did for their real job. They were goldsmiths. They were temple servants. They were priests. They were high priests. There's even a section where it says the perfume makers chipped in. They were moving brick. And you think to yourself, the people who make perfume for a living are probably not the most manual labor cliched kind of people. You know when you hang out with people who are cement workers or pipe fitters and you shake their hand and immediately you think to yourself, they just broke my hand because they're so strong. Probably not the case when you meet a perfume maker. But nonetheless, everybody is chipping in. Everybody is lending a hand. Everybody is part of the process. It's not something that's sort of delegated to a few. Rather, in the service of God, he calls everybody to participate. And the way that the Bible is written, again, is very clever because in the middle of this section where it says everybody was participating, all the people from every different walks of life, the bankers, the baristas, everybody. Then there's a section that says, well, except for this certain group of people. In verse 5 of chapter 3, it says that the elders or the noble men of a certain region of Tekoa, they didn't participate because they thought it was beneath them. They didn't want to get dirty. I mean, I'm sort of editorializing, but it explicitly says everybody was doing it except for the rich people. The people who had too much social standing to risk getting dirty. And then as the chapter goes on, because the Bible does these great sort of, politically and culturally subversive things, it picks out another people group. It says everybody is doing it, except these people, the rich people. And then it goes on to say, and everybody is doing it, including this guy and his daughters. Now, we hear that, and we're kind of like, okay, the daughters got selected, that's cool. But we have to remember that in those days, oftentimes women weren't really seen as socially equal, or they weren't always seen as being worthy of being written about. That's not the way that God wants it to be. It's just kind of the way that it happens. That a certain kind of people group, in this case, women are oftentimes sort of being just sort of assumed in the story or neglected in the story. Yet nonetheless, after the Bible just got done saying that the rich and powerful, the people who had a lot socially, were unwilling to work, here's a group of daughters who were willing to. And so it's the Bible's subtle way of putting down people that society lifts up, while at the same time lifts up the people that society oftentimes pushes down. And then as the story goes on in chapter 4, the enemy comes back with warfare. Psychological warfare, first of all. And this is in verses 1 through 6, if you want to follow along. It says that when they heard about that they were rebuilding the wall, the villains, they became angry and they ridiculed them in the presence of all of their associates. And here's the thing. Now it's not just sort of Sanballat and Tobiah, and then in earlier passages there's an Arab guy who's there too. Now it says it's all those people, plus they're also in the presence of all of their associates and the army of Samaria. So you can see how the threat is growing. And they say, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices a day? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring these stones back to life? Because a lot of this stuff was destroyed when Jerusalem was destroyed. The gates are destroyed. They got some material from the lumber, but a lot of the stones that they were using were the stones that were destroyed or like half destroyed. They just weren't as great as they were supposed to be. And then Tobiah says, what are they doing? What are they building? Even if a fox were to come up and jump on the wall would collapse. You can kind of see the pictures like when a kid tries to build a tree fort. Or a kid builds a snowman, and you're just kind of like, oh, that's nice. It's not great, but it's nice. That's sort of what's going on here. What they're doing isn't the work of professionals. And they're using, in some cases, secondhand material. And so you can just imagine how that would discourage the people. They're really, really proud of their work, and then all of a sudden they turn around and they say, oh, they're right. This isn't so good. What are we doing? Is this even worth it? Are we wasting our time serving God when we see our accomplishments and we're kind of like, well, where's the glory? It's not that great. And so when they're faced with that adversity, that discouragement, Nehemiah prays and he says, hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn back their insults on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in the land of captivity. Don't cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the faces of the builders. This raises an interesting question of how do we sort of reconcile this idea of praying for God's justice versus God's command to love our enemies. Sometimes I think what happens is that the God of the Old Testament is pitted against the God of the New Testament, or Jesus, as sort of old God is bad, Jesus is better. Or they worked out the kinks in the, like, you know, when you first got the first iPhone, and there were all these things that weren't working really well, and then the new iPhone started coming out, and they got all those bugs and glitches fixed. In some cases, that's how people view the God of the Old Testament versus Jesus. They got the kinks and the bugs and all the glitches worked out, and now we have Jesus, who is the God of love. Yet nonetheless, the Bible teaches us that the God of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures, is the God of the New Testament. That he doesn't change. His character is the same. And even when we read passages in the Scriptures about, in the book of Psalms, and it says where God hates the wicked. Do I not hate those, Lord, who hate you? And so we think to ourselves, well, that's the Old Testament. But Jesus also talks about how there will come a time when he even says to the people who have rejected him, away from me, for I never knew you. Where Jesus holds people accountable for their willful rejection of him. And Jesus says, away from me, for I do not know you. And it says that they are cast out from God's presence into a place of utter darkness. Where God's justice is handed over to people. And also in the book of Revelation, where it talks about people, it sort of gives them a sneak peek into what's going on in heaven. It shows a picture of people who have died in their faithfulness to God. And people who are sort of living on this side of the cross, post-Jesus, say, how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood? And God doesn't say, oh, don't say that. That's not loving. God says, wait a little bit longer. And then finally in the book of the end of Revelation, where God finally unleashes all of his wrath, all of his fury, holds everybody accountable, including the devil and these symbols of opposition to God's people, when he finally holds them accountable, there's this passage in Revelation chapter 19 where it says, salvation belongs to our God. Like the whole world is praising God. And it said the reason why they're praising God is because his judgments are just and true. So God is being praised for his justice against people and systems that have rejected him. And so at the end of the day, for this prayer that Nehemiah prays, that God would hold people accountable for their actions, as well as Jesus telling us not to take vengeance on our enemies, but rather trusting them to God, it brings us back to the reality that God is the one who judges people and holds the accountable wicked for what they do. And that God's patience in this, not holding people accountable, God's patience, his long-suffering, his pleas for repentance, they're not God's indifference towards evil. It's not God's indifference towards suffering. They're not God's turning a blind eye and declaring evil good. They're not any of that, but rather it's God's patience. It is his love that is waiting, that is postponing his justice. The scriptures say that he is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished. It says after they were encouraged by that prayer, they kept working. Everybody worked with their hearts, the fullness of their hearts. And at the end of the day, half of the city was built, or half the city wall was built. But eventually, your energy runs out, even when you are motivated. And so the villains see that their taunts weren't enough, and so they get their army together, and they sort of just kind of hang off to the side, but in plain view of everybody, to let them know that the threat is still there. They could attack them at any moment. Now, probably they wouldn't attack them with the entire force, because remember, Nehemiah is there with the approval of Artaxerxes. And so if the whole group gets attacked, Artaxerxes may come and stick up for them. So they're probably going to engage in guerrilla warfare or insurgency or, kind of street fighting, just enough to disrupt them and just enough to distract them and just enough to discourage them to think maybe it's not worth it. And so when the nation is confronted with this adversity, it says in verse 9 of chapter 4, we prayed to our God, and we posted a guard to meet the threat. This time everybody's praying. And the people come back to Nehemiah and they say, we're running out of energy, we're running out of materials, and we're under constant threat of attack. It's like that imagery if you're in a shipwreck or if you're in a plane crash and you're sitting in a life raft and the life raft is slowly deflating and you see the sharks circling underneath you, or you're in a cartoon and you're walking through the dark and scary forest and you can see the eyes of the animals who are just waiting for you to mess up. That's what they're living under. And Nehemiah sort of has this comment that says, I know this. You've told me 10 times. I'm aware of what's going on. They're in this situation that if something doesn't happen, they're done for. And so they pray again, and they post even more guards. Nehemiah says, don't be afraid. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Remember that God is on our side. And also, fight for your families as well. And so Nehemiah points to this very real situation, and he says, don't give up. Remember, God is still here. God is still who he says he is. And he quotes from back in chapter 1, he says, God is great and he is awesome. And so we think also of the book of Joshua as they're going into the promised land. Do not be afraid. Remember that God is here, and he is the one who is fighting for you. Be strong and courageous. And also, if it does happen, fight for your family's lives. If you read enough about war like I do, and you read enough firsthand accounts from the battlefront, if we're thinking about World War II specifically, where it just seems like the odds are stacked against the Allies, the thing that gets people through, the thing that sort of motivates them to fight, even in the face of overwhelming odds, is not, you're not fighting for the flag anymore. You're not fighting for the Constitution anymore. You're not fighting for the good of the people you're trying to set free. You're not fighting for even your own safety. Rather, you're fighting for the person next to you. And that's what motivates you. Because you spent enough time to know that this person is my top priority. So Nehemiah does that as well. It basically says, fight for your family. And it says that God basically stopped the attacks after that. He says that the plans of the enemy were thwarted. And as the city continued to be built, they basically came up with this structure where it's like half the people had swords and half the people had bricks. Half the people were building the wall, and the other half were standing there just to make sure that nothing happened. That when the material runners went to go get something, they came back with a brick in one hand and a sword in the other. Really, really slows down your progress. Really, really halts whatever advances you were making. But they were safe. It says that Nehemiah, and as the chapter closes, Nehemiah and the other guards, they didn't have time to change their clothes. They didn't have time to go on vacation. Everybody slept in the city at night, and they went and they worked from dawn till dusk. And that's the end of chapter 4. And as the worship team comes up to lead us in communion, we might be thinking to ourselves, what in the world does this have to do with following Jesus? This reminds us that as we go to the Lord's table, that God still calls us to follow him, to be strong and courageous, but that our weapons are not meant to be relying solely on political power or military strength or even protection from physical attacks, but rather the weapons of warfare that we use reflect our enemy's abilities. We are reminded, as the scriptures tell us in Ephesians chapter 6, that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it is against the spiritual forces. And so God tells us through the Apostle Paul to use the armor of God to extinguish the attacks of the enemy. And we're reminded in Nehemiah, they prayed together, they worked together, they encouraged each other in this. And the same way, Ephesians 6 tells us to be strong in the Lord. Put on the armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil and the spiritual forces that are attacked. Put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you could stand your ground. Stand firm with the truth, with the belt of truth. Stand firm with the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet feated with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith to which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one that he shoots at you to discourage you and make you think that following Jesus isn't worth it. Take on the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. So even though we may face different challenges, God calls us to face them together, to encourage one another, and to rely on the gifts that God has given us in Jesus. Let's pray.